Larry Summers, the director of the National Economic Council under President Obama and Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming in. What's your reaction to this latest report? What should people take from it?
This was about what people expected. It shows that inflation is not where it was a couple of years ago. All kinds of bottlenecks have eased. The Fed has tightened policy. But it also shows that we're not securely at the Fed's 2% inflation target. And so we've learned from the election just how toxic inflation and high prices and high interest rates are to the American people, that causes them great anger, great disillusionment with institutions, creates a dynamic that's very strongly anti-incumbent. And so the lesson that policymakers, both in the executive branch, the president, the secretary of the Treasury, and in the Fed, need to take away from this is that we've got to stay focused on the inflation problem. And frankly, I don't think there's enough focus on the inflation problem. The Fed has been in too much of a hurry to cut interest rates and much too much of a hurry to promise future interest rate cuts. They keep giving signals that they're going to cut them a lot and then having to walk those signals back. That's what's happened in the last 2 or 3 months. And I think the biggest lesson in all of this is for President Trump. If he carries through on what he said during his campaign, there will be an inflation shock significantly greater than the one the country suffered in 2021. He has promised, if you add it all up, more than $10 trillion in tax cuts relative to the current trajectory. He has called into question by politicizing the credibility of the Fed. He said that the dollar needs to go down, not up, raising the price of every imported good. And much more importantly, on the supply side, he's called for pushing up all kinds of prices by putting an across-the-board tariff on, which will raise the price not just of imported goods, but of American goods that use imported goods as an input, also raise the price of goods that have to compete with imports. And look, I think every sensible American thinks we need to do more to secure our border. But if you're talking about deporting millions of people, that is an invitation to labor shortage and bottlenecks. So I hope that he will get the message from this election and adjust his program so that it is not inflationary. And I certainly hope that if his program is inflationary, it will not be accommodated by the Federal Reserve.
When you talk about this inflation shock that could come from these policies, when what we saw during the campaign was he was not quiet about what he wanted to do. You listed out some of the things that he has promoted during the campaign in terms of the tariffs, tax cuts, mass deportation. When you add all of that together, then you also look at the side-by-side of this is what a lot of Americans voted for. This is what helped him get elected, at least in part. What do you think people are missing if you think it could be so damaging if it all was put into practice?
I don't think people are professional economists. I don't think people trace through the impacts of policies like deportations or tariffs for the inflation rate. We don't rely on people to figure out what kind of nuclear reactor is going to be safe, and we don't rely on people to do complex economic analysis. And look, there are no certainties. Economic forecasts always have errors in them. But I think there would be a very strong and very widespread view that if implemented, these policies are inflationary. Now, I think many people hope that these policies are being used as threats to get other countries to reduce their trade barriers, that they're being used to send signals with respect to immigration, and that it won't actually be these policies that will be implemented. We'll have to see. What I can say quite confidently as an economist is that if these policies are implemented, it will mean a substantial increase in the price level. And substantial increases in the price level, we've seen how people react to those. You know, in many ways, we're seeing something we've seen before. The large checks that were sent out in 2021 were what people wanted. They just didn't want the consequences that came with it in terms of increased inflation. The job of responsible leadership is not simply to stick your finger in the air. It's to think about what policies will be in the long run interest of the country. And I have to say that economists fight and disagree about many things, but the idea that this program cumulatively, bashing the Fed, raising tariffs, sending workers home, bloating budget deficits, the idea that it is a highly inflationary program, that generates about as much consensus among people who follow economic things as any proposition I can remember in the 40 years I've been doing this.
Especially and in an industry where there often is not consensus. That says quite a lot. Larry Summers, it's always good to have your perspective. Thank you so much. Markets just opened, and this comes just after new data has shown that inflation is moving in the wrong direction right now. The first inflation report since the election just out, showing price increases accelerated last month after slowing for 6 straight months. CNN Matt Egan has been looking at this data. He's joining us now. So, Matt, Donald Trump, he ran on saying he would lower inflation. He'd bring things back down to where everyone wants it to be. I spoke with former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers just last hour, and he had a warning, per se, for Donald Trump about all of the economic promises that he made from the campaign trail. Let me play this for you.
If he carries through on what he said during his campaign, there will be an inflation shock significantly greater than the one the country suffered in 2021. If you're talking about deporting millions of people, that is an invitation to labor shortage and bottlenecks. So I hope that he will get the message from this election and adjust his program so that it is not inflationary.
So we'll see on that. But what does today's inflation report, how does that add to kind of the picture of the economy that Donald Trump's about to inherit?
Yeah, Kate. Well, today's report was a setback, but perhaps just a temporary one. I'll explain in a second. Let's look at the numbers. Today's report showed that consumer prices increased by 2.6% year over year in October. That was exactly as expected.
Right.
But this was an acceleration from the month before when we saw the inflation rate at 2.4%. It was a 3-year low. This is the first time in 7 months that we've seen the rate of inflation go up. But what is really important to note is that on a monthly basis, prices only went up slightly. And so that does suggest that this has to do more with the calendar. The fact that a year ago, the rate of inflation was falling rapidly, and that was always going to be really hard to live up to. And I think that because these numbers came in as expected, because we knew there were going to be these calendar effects, that's why the market is not really freaking out. We saw stock futures turn positive, and look at this, the U.S. market opening, the Dow up about 100 points in the first few minutes of trading. So no big concern there. When we look into some of the categories, there was some good news. Prices fell for some things like gasoline and clothes, but used cars went up significantly. Also airfare as well. I think when we zoom out and we look at the big picture, it's clear things have improved significantly from 2 years ago when the rate of inflation, look at that, was at 9%. Gas was $5 a gallon. But it's also clear that we're not back to normal, and that last mile of getting inflation back to normal is proving to be a bit challenging.
Yeah, it sure is. It's great. Thanks for running through it.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it, Matt.